Hi everybody, my name's Peter Laws and I'd like to welcome you to the Flicks the Church Forgot, where I explore the spiritual and the thoughtful side of horror. Normally this is an audio podcast, but I'm experimenting with trying this with video, and so bear with me as I explore the technology and try this sort of thing out. Got a big old microphone stuck in my face just to make sure that the sound is reasonably good. Now tonight we're going to be looking at the much acclaimed horror drama from Australia, The Babadook. Horror trades in death or decay. Ironically, I suppose death is the very lifeblood through which much scary movie works and moves. Whether it's encounters with the supernatural or the other side or the fear of the monster or the slasher killer, the subtext of any true horror film will have death's fingerprint on it somewhere, even by definition. And I would say that's probably a good way of judging if a horror film is indeed a horror film or not. For example, things like the Twilight movies and books use the furniture of a gothic horror like vampires and werewolves, and so in a sense some people might class them as horror. Some Christians might class them as horror, but what they are really about is romance and perhaps the struggle with growing sexual desire. From what I've seen, they don't center on death, decay, and mutation, and therefore they're not really horror films in the truest sense. And I'm sure that the people who make them would be happy not to have that label either. That's not what they're getting at. Yet for the rest of horror, and for the truly great horror movies, what they do is they keep probing and pressing that horrible latent dread that's in each of us, that actually, when you think about it today, you have walked past a building that is going to be standing longer than you have. That there are trees growing in forests somewhere that will outlive you, and that will outlive me, and the hands and the lips and the eyes that we have to make sense of this world are not going to last forever. Of course, we don't tend to think about that and our mortality because it's a bit of a downer, and so many of us walk around feeling like we're effectively immortal, as if we're kidding ourselves that we really are going to live forever. But of course, we're not. Death is coming in one sense or another. And I think there is a sensible, realistic part of our psyche which demands that we do not shut that fact out. And I wonder if that's why horror is so popular, and also why it resonates so much with young people in particular, and teenagers and even children. Because death can seem so far away to some of us, so distant, but our subconscious is saying, you're not supposed to ignore this stuff. You have to accept it like a shadow in the back of your mind, because believe me, it's coming. And death's not just coming for you, but it's coming for those around you too. I realize that's a very hideously depressing thought, but it's the reason, I think, why horror tends to push buttons and is such an attractive concept to people. For some people, they think, why would you watch horror? I think it's because it's pushing on this subconscious button that we really ought to press. Now, perhaps that's why The Babadook works so well, because it's a horror movie that not only beds itself in the themes of horror, of death, but it actively faces death head on, and with it, the gut-wrenching power of grief. Now, the film centers on a single mother called Amelia, who we discover has lost her husband in a car crash on the way to the hospital to have her son. And we find her with her son now, 6 or 7 years old. He's called Oscar, and he's a handful. And she's trying to cope with the loss of her husband and the demands of parenting. Especially hard when Oscar is freaking out because he thinks a monster is going to come and hurt him, and especially hurt his mother. Now, this idea of somebody grieving at the beginning of a horror movie is not exactly rare in horror. It's very well trodden ground, and I think my favorite perhaps example is George C. Scott in The Changeling. And I think some of the criticisms I've read from audiences of reviews of The Babadook is that they feel like it does nick from, it steals from other horror movies. And indeed, yes, there's the shadowy figure in the doorway which disappears on the second look, or there's the object that they try to get rid of and then it comes back on the doorstep later. Yes, there are cliches in a sense, but the emotional core of The Babadook is what gives these seeming cliches a great distressing edge and a great power. Now, Amelia used to be a freelance writer, but since she's become a single mum and a widow, she's had to give that up, and so she's looking after her young son, Oscar, and we quickly start to realize that really he has, for want of a better term, behavioral problems. He's obsessed with the idea that there's this monster coming to hurt him and his mum, and so he keeps building all sorts of like Nightmare on Elm Street style booby traps, to fight against the thing once it actually arrives. And so he ends up making some makeshift weapons at school, and that ends up looks like he's going to get expelled or at least have some sort of supervision. And so Amelia wants to deal with this and takes him out of school for a couple of days, and that's the sort of the setup of our film. And she can't deal with this very well because she is absolutely exhausted, and I think this is what really makes the Babadook stand above many other horror movies in the sense that there is this emotional core of the parenting which is really challenging, and we'll talk about this in a moment. I mean, anyone who has children is going to have a queasy sense of recognition when they watch this. The constant interruptions to sleep, the noise, the endlessly cleaning up of things, the having to be an authority figure and then a consoling friendship figure within the space of like 2 minutes. These are all the pressures of parenthood, and that is really at the heart of what the Babadook begins to be about, the film begins to be about. There's a really cool scene where Oscar is trying to sleep, and he can't sleep because he's scared of monsters, and so he's lying asleep in his mum's bed, and he keeps just reaching over and he's like scratching her on the neck, and he's grinding his teeth really, really loudly, like and she's just lying there, exhausted, being near to him because she's supposed to support him, of course, but she's effectively becoming nothing more than a human comfort blanket, and she's gradually unwinding psychologically at the constant lack of sleep and stress. She looks out while she's doing the washing up, and she can see an old lady who lives opposite, who's got Parkinson's disease, who's sitting watching TV all night, and there's this impression that, wow, is this what she's basically going to become? They're no different, these women. All of these powerful vignettes give a sense that she is a sort of prisoner to parenthood, which is something we'll touch on again in a moment. But anyway, she keeps showing love to this kid, Oscar, and is amazingly patient, at least at first. So even without the horror elements, the Babadook is working, I think, as a refreshingly honest and untarnished view of family life. But it's into this strong dramatic base comes this red-bound children's book, which Oscar finds on the bookshelf. And the film has established already that she reads to him overnight when she's shattered and she comes in from work at the dementia home. But suddenly, there's this book on the shelf called Mr. Babadook, which neither her nor her son have ever seen before. Now, this acceptance of a random book in the house might seem like it stretches credulity to audiences, but I can vouch for this myself. Kids get given books from all sorts of sources, and from presents and friends to relatives and schools and libraries. So really, it's not unusual to suddenly find that your kid's got a book on a shelf that you've really never seen, and you've got no idea where the heck it came from. So Oscar opens this mysterious book, Mr. Babadook, and the mum starts to read it, and it is a weird, seemingly handmade pop-up book made of a sort of German expressionist charcoal style. And at first it seems like any other quirky story, albeit a little ominous looking. But Amelia starts to wonder, is this book a little bit too scary for such a sensitive kid, and suggests that they read something else. But no, Oscar's enjoying it. He wants to keep watching it, keep listening to it, because it seems strange yet probably innocuous. So she reads on. Yet as this book, becomes more and more disturbing, the son starts to realize that this is not going to have a very happy ending, and this is really bad. Now Oscar's starting to freak out. He's going, "Wow, Mum, does he get the boy? Is he under the bed?" And as she flicks through the rest of it, she's reading it in her head, so Oscar can't hear, and she realizes that this Babadook fellow is a seriously twisted, homicidal character, and she shuts the book with a snap. And we cut to the next brilliant shot, which is Oscar, and he's screaming while she's sort of clamping him down and trying to calmly read from another kid-friendly story where he's just freaking out. But it's too late, of course, because just closing this book is not enough. And in time, Amelia starts to notice shadows out of the corner of her eye and strange scrapings and rumbles at night. The question is the Babadook a real supernatural entity slipping from the pages of myth and fable, or is he some sort of figment of their collective depression and grief? Now, this is what I love about this film, that there really are multiple ways of reading it. And perhaps that is precisely one of the reasons why some audiences might watch this and wonder what all the fuss is about. To be honest, I've heard some people say that they find this film quite frustrating, that it's illogical, that it doesn't resolve how it should have, that the characters aren't very likable, or that there isn't enough reveal of the monster. Well, I think I appreciate the Babadook, and you may appreciate it or you may not, depending on what side of your brain is most dominant. Yeah, people are either right-brained or left-brained. And right-brained are like sort of intuitive and imaginative, and left-brain people tend to prefer logic and rationality and strategy. Now, of course, it's all a bit of a spectrum, and it's a generalization for many people, and I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I would say that when it comes to cinema, I am definitely a right-brain type of guy. In other words, I only need a few bits of information and I become satisfied with the ideas my brain comes up with. So I'm quite happy that you don't see a full-on shot of the Babadook. But also, this idea that the Babadook might be real or figurative might leave some people confused, but I can happily enjoy the film if both or indeed neither are true. My preferred reading of the Babadook, I think, is that it's the latter, actually, that it's some sort of study of psychology, or at least when the psychology and depression becomes manifest in reality, an expression of their own grief. This monster is grief. Yet I know many people who would just watch this film who are perhaps more left-brained and think, this is just weird and unexpected, and it does things that it shouldn't ought to do, and it doesn't end or resolve the way it ought to. I love the way it ended, but some people are left baffled thinking that it's really too off-kilter, that it's not really resolved. For me, it's the perfect sort of ending. It presents characters that I think are quite likable, but I've read other people feeling that they're really horrible, and some people said that we're rooting for the Babadook to murder the kid and the mum as quickly as possible. I wasn't one of those people. As a quick aside, I get the sense that too many studio executives are overpopulated by left-brained people because they insist on clear, full resolvement in stories. And perhaps there's an economic reason for that, because people get jumpy at unresolved or indeed unhappy endings, like, for example, Stephen King's The Mist, where Frank Darabont added on this scary, depressing ending, which I really loved, but some people said it was a ruinous ending to the film as a whole. But I think that because the Babadook refuses to wrap everything up in a tight little package, it's going to leave much food for right-brainers to chomp through, but perhaps not enough meat for left-brainers to latch onto. For me, though, the way it concludes makes perfect sense, and it's filled with realistic hope, because if the Babadook really is more of a personification of grief and the depression that comes with it, then I feel that this film is saying something important and profound. It's saying that grief, when it comes, will assault you, it will haunt you, and it will cruelly take over you and may even turn you into something else. And the only way to deal with it realistically is not to blast it out of the water, but to accept that it is now part of your life. And there can be hope again, but there's always going to be this shadow lurking, and that you need to accept that. And not to act surprised if you see grief's shoulder in some shadowy doorway in a summer's day. These are powerful grown-up ideas which some people might not notice simply because they don't think that way, and that's fine. But all I'm saying is, when I watched it, this is what my brain was doing when I was watching the film. I was thinking about all these thematic ideas. There's a recurring motif in this, which I think plugs in well to this grief reading, that Amelia... reading sounds very pedantic, but you know what I mean. Amelia's got this toothache, and she keeps pushing on her jaw, and she's like, all the way through it, and you really feel it. And there's this throb of pain, and you think the only way to get rid of a toothache, maybe, is just to get that tooth and yank it out. But if, of course, she was to do that, she would leave a hole there, and after all, it was probably the hole that was causing the ache in the first place. And my point is, even if we have a toothache and we rip the tooth out, we have to live with the hole. We still live with the ache. So for me, the Babadook works as a brilliant and honest look at the frightening power of grief, and I think if I was to suffer grief in some ways, and I'm sure I will one day, I think the Babadook would be a strange comfort to me, because I'm not a person who is content with just ignoring the sadness of life. I have deep, dark questions, and I feel like I'm not being fully human unless I discuss them and reflect on them, and a film like this helps you do that. If you've lost a loved one, or if you know somebody who has, pretending that life can suddenly be absolutely back to normal is simply unrealistic, particularly if they're really close. Nobody's suggesting that we throw ourselves into depressed introspection. And the Babadook doesn't say that either. The film doesn't say that. It simply says you take seriously the period of intense loss and accept that there's a hole that will never really go away. And it perhaps can be managed and tamed in some ways, but there's always the possibility that it will threaten to come out and consume you again. The film, by the way, is not just about grief of a loved one dying, but I'd say it's also about other types of grief too. And after the strong setup of facing the relentless pressures of parenthood, we realise that the film also addresses the griefs that parents can experience for the pre-child life. Let me explain what I mean. Parents, whether they admit it or not, can sometimes find themselves going through a grieving process for the freedoms that they once had before children. You have a child and your life changes in so many different ways, but one of the main ways is the freedom to always do what you want. My wife and I, for example, before we had kids, could anytime we felt like it just go outside to the pub, to the cinema or whatever, or maybe go for a walk or go on holiday whenever we wanted, at whichever time of the year we wanted. We could sleep in, we could watch whatever we felt like on TV, even in the middle of the daytime we could watch something that was an 18 certificate and it would be fine. And yet once you have children, that changes. Life becomes like bartering, who's babysitting, so the other one can go out, or how can we manage to get another babysitter to come, which is a really important part of a relationship to be able to keep going out. But what I'm saying is things change. A trivial example, perhaps, is, I watch a lot of horror movies and I can't just stick them on during the daytime anymore like I used to. I can't have my kids sitting, doing a colouring book while I'm watching the Babadook. I may have done that when they were tiny babies. I must admit I did watch The Exorcist Blu-ray with my 5-week-old daughter sat on my lap. But nowadays, they look up and they notice this stuff and they have ears. And so you end up watching a lot of kids' movies you would never have even bothered watching before. Man, I'm sick of seeing Barbie films, but I know quite a lot of the Barbie movies now. You plow so much money and time and resources. I'm not suggesting that having kids is bad and that you'd want to trade it for the old life, though some might. But it's absolutely appropriate and acceptable for for parents to sometimes miss their old lives and to reminisce about it with a strong sense of nostalgia and even grief. And in the Babadook, I think it's even harder for Amelia because she's this lone parent suffering from the loss of her husband, and because it's just her, she's doing everything herself, which is a recipe for exhaustion. Kids have this habit of interrupting everything you do, and the sleep is one of the major ones. Now, I realize it sounds like I'm moaning here, and I appreciate that many people don't have children, or indeed they want to have kids and they can't. I'm merely pointing out that what's good about the film The Babadook is that it takes the idea of parenthood and it's willing to admit that sometimes kids certainly breathe life into you, and they absolutely do. And I don't have any regrets, but sometimes they can suck life out of you too. The film's similar to The Shining in that way. It certainly starts to move in Shining-esque angles at times. I want to read you a quotation from Stephen King speaking in the Stephen King Companion when he was honest enough to explain his thoughts on parenting that inspired The Shining. And he says, "Sometimes you confess. You always hide what you're confessing to. That's one of the reasons why you make up the story. When I wrote The Shining, for instance, the protagonist of The Shining is a man who broke his son's arm, who has a history of child beating who was beaten himself. And as a young father with 2 children, I was horrified by my occasional feelings of antagonism towards my children. Won't you ever stop? Won't you ever go to bed? And time has given me the idea that probably there are a lot of young fathers and young mothers both who feel angry, who have angry feelings towards their children, but as somebody who has been raised with the idea of leave it to Beaver and all that sort of stuff, I would think to myself, if he doesn't shut up. So I wrote the book. I wrote a lot of that down and tried to get it out of my system, but it was also a confession. Yes, there are times I felt very angry towards my children and have even felt that I could hurt them. I think that's powerful stuff and honest stuff, and it ties in with the ideas of The Babadook, that it's not just a film about a woman and a son being invaded by a monster. It's about a young free writer wife who gets invaded by a child. A child which completely reorders her world, including taking her husband away, literally just changing her life completely. And what's great, I think, about the film as well is that it also points to a great sense of hope beyond that. That the griefs that we go through are real, and absolutely should be acknowledged, but the day is coming when there's the hope that we might tame them. Now, speaking as a Christian, you might get the impression that when it comes to death, I'm sort of like punching the air saying, woohoo, everything's going to be all right. The future's bright. Heaven's coming indeed. I meet some elderly Christians who have been they've been told that they're dying, and they actually rejoice, and they've even said to me, like, whoa, I'm going to glory, you know, and the Bible becomes like a holiday brochure to them. And who knows, if I have ever got to face death, of course I will, maybe God will swoop in and give me that sort of unshakable confidence. But can I be honest with you, for now, I find death as disturbing as anyone else. And what's more, it's not so much my own death that brings the most shadows to mind, but it's the deaths of those I love. Christianity has a word of hope to say to all that, but let's be honest, it's one of my most treasured thoughts about faith, that death doesn't have to be the end. But let's be honest, nowhere in the Christian faith does it say that death doesn't happen, or indeed doesn't affect people. Even Jesus wept with grief. Even Jesus met his own Babadook. The Babadook tackles this subject head on and reminds us that no matter who we are, whether we believe in God or not, death is truly an offense to our psyche. Indeed, I keep thinking of what it must have been like for Amelia that night in the hospital when she was going with her husband to start a new chapter in their lives, and childbirth is one of the scariest moments anyway in life. But then to think that she has to do it within hours of seeing her husband, who was supposed to be her companion for this, ripped away from the world. It's almost too much to bear. I realize this is a fictional story, but I am aware that it happens in real life. Of course it does. So death is an offense. It rubs up against us, and we simply cannot accept it. And perhaps we can't accept it because evolution has taught us to have a survival instinct. Or maybe it's because we've been designed for eternal life, and so it offends us because death is actually a passageway and not an ending. And so our resistance to oblivion is simply good instincts, because oblivion may not actually exist at all. Whatever the case, horror is the genre that refuses to let us leap off into a rainbow-filled room filled with bubbles, pretending that shadows don't exist. I know some Christians might prefer believers to watch things that only reflect that which is happy and hopeful, and good for them if that's what they want to do. And I'm as keen as the next guy to watch life-affirming happy stuff. Heck, I'll gladly watch soppy romantic comedies with my wife because they speak into other truths that need to be learned. You know, the need for companionship, the power of romantic love, the vitalness of laughter. But horror films like The Babadook have this habit of grabbing you and shaking you, and they say, grow up. Get real. Life is wonderful, but life will end for those around you and for you. For me, that sort of scary thought drives me to think metaphysically, think about God and the prospect of that, to seek out some sort of hope in the darkness. For others, it simply might fling them into depressed introspection and constant fear. However you deal with grief, though, we're not stupid. We know that we have our own Babadook. He is there, and he's waiting. He's waiting for the book of events to open and the cogs to start moving, and a time will come when he will invade my world and yours, and we will have to battle with him not to consume us. I feel that it's my faith that gives me my most potent weapon against him, getting fully under my skin. But my faith does not pluck me out of reality. I've got to accept that if the Babadook is grief, then I need to prepare myself to meet him one day, because he is certainly preparing even now to meet me. I dread the day when I meet my own Babadook, my own assault of grief, but like Amelia and like Oscar in the film, I'll be looking for the light in the crack in the corner of the door. And maybe I'm naive, and maybe I'm grasping at right-brained straws. I admit I might be. But I do have this constant tick-tock feeling that sometimes is loud and sometimes it's worryingly hard to hear, but it tends to be there nonetheless. That when the shadows fill my room, I believe there's going to be something. I believe there's going to be some sort of God who gave me eternal spark, which I hope is going to get me through to the other side. So, in short, I really recommend The Babadook as a thoughtful horror parable. I guess a quick question, is it scary? Well, yeah. Mainly, it's so suggestive and surreal at times, and what's more, it avoids extreme CGI in favor of more theatrical stage tricks, so I think, yeah, it's great. Big Hollywood people, if you're listening to this, not like you are, but if you were, you have to pay attention to films like this if you want to make the big screen horror blockbusters stand the test of time. Remember that frightening power of subtlety and suggestion does work. Is it the scariest movie I've ever seen? No. In fact, one of the scariest films I've seen is Roman Polanski's Repulsion, which I'm not surprised to find was a direct influence on this. I hadn't realized, but I read up on it. And it was. But no, this is scary, but it's not like crazy scary. There's one moment, in fact, when the Babadook is like, it's employing too many camera techniques when he's climbing around on the ceiling, and that took me out of it for a moment. But instead, I'd say the film is frightening in an emotional sense, on a conceptual level. That's where the film really shines and creeps. Put it this way. I watched the Babadook in my house on my own while my 2 kids slept in bed. My wife was away at a conference at work. In fact, she still is. And as I drifted off to bed last night alone, did I listen to some spooky music like I do on my iPhone sometimes when I go to sleep? No, I chose not to. In fact, I chose to listen to a bit of Knight Rider soundtrack instead because I didn't fancy getting too creeped out. But did I dream about the Babadook? Yeah, I did. Or rather, I had a nightmare about a woman who looked like the woman from the film. And I was related to her somehow in the film, and she was demonically possessed. And she slowly turned into the terrifying woman from the bed from Mario Bava's A Drop of Water segment from Black Sabbath. Can you remember that? Well, if you haven't seen it, you have if you've seen the Babadook, because it actually makes a screen appearance when Amelia's watching TV at night, and she watches a clip of it, so that's why it was in my brain. And I remember waking up in the middle of the night last night with shadows all around me, desperately trying to think of something else so I wouldn't tumble back into a dream with this Babadook woman crawling toward me on a bed. So yes, on that basis, I'd say the Babadook ticks all the important horror boxes. It has the power to move, it has the power to inspire, but yeah, it also has the power to scare. Well, that's it for another Flicks the Church Forgot. Thanks for listening, and remember, you can follow me on Twitter or at Rev Peter Laws, or check out my Facebook page at the Flicks the Church Forgot. But until next time, watch out for the Babadook, both the film and I guess the man himself. But don't get too freaked out. And don't forget the Flicks the Church Forgot.